So again, that court case was brought in 2006. And even as that case has started to fade in memory, there have always been, reminders of it here and there, right? The D.C. Maddow case came up again when David Vitter tried to run for Louisiana governor this year. It's part of the reason he's not the Louisiana governor right now. And those unreleased records, there's always been wonderings and whisperings about what other names might have been in the D.C. Maddow's black book. What other names and phone numbers were in those records that nobody's seen yet? Because of that restraining order from the court, though, nobody's really ever thought those names would see the light of day. As we reported earlier this week, though, something seems to have changed on that front this year. In January of this year, the lawyer from the D.C. Maddow case, who again, he says he has those records, but he's under court order not to release them. He says he came to the realization, came to a decision at the beginning of this year, that he had a new reason to want to release those records. He says he now wants to release those records because they are a matter of national importance. He says what's in those records is relevant to the 2016 presidential race. And no, he won't say what he means by that. But over the last few weeks, he has been trying to basically get released from that restraining order. He's been trying to get permission from the courts to release those remaining records. He's now made an application to the U.S. District Court, which initially put in the restraining order. He's made a representation to the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in D.C. He's, as of this week, made a representation to the United States Supreme Court, saying, quote, time is of the essence. He's saying the Supreme Court must consider this case. They must give him permission to release those records. They must do it soon because he says it's a matter of national importance. He says it has to be now because it may very well affect who the people of the United States want to elect as their next president of the United States. So that's where we left it on Tuesday of this week, after he had delivered that application to the United States Supreme Court saying, please let me release these records. Well, as of now, we've got news, because now two more things have happened. First is that the lawyer in this case now claims that he has installed a dead man switch on these records. He says now that when he realized, or he came to the decision that these records, these unreleased escort agency records, were relevant to this year's presidential race, he says that he took out what amounts to an insurance policy to protect himself, so no one would be threatened to harm him physically as a way of preventing these records from being released. Montgomery Blair Sibley first told U.S. News and World Report today, and then later confirmed to us, that he has hidden online in 4 different locations on 4 different servers PDF versions of these escort agency records, which he says include the names and addresses of 815 alleged clients of the D.C. Maddow. He says he has set up a doomsday switch, a dead man's switch, which is basically designed to automatically reveal the location of those records online if he does nothing for a period of 72 hours. Remember, a dead man switch is not activated by you doing something. A dead man switch is activated by you unexpectedly doing nothing. The way he described it to us today is as a, quote, 72-hour clock. He told us, quote, the 72-hour clock releases the records if I disappear for 72 hours. I reset the clock daily. Stranger things have happened, so I am taking no chances. He then further elaborated to U.S. News and World Report, telling them today that the 72-hour clock is rigged. So what it specifically does is that if it counts all the way down, all 72 hours, without him acting to reset it, quote, dozens of reporters will receive a website link directing them where to find the documents online. Quote, if I die, disappear, whatever, they will be out. So that's the first thing that's happened today. There's a dead man switch on the D.C. Maddow unreleased records. At least the lawyer says there is. So I don't know if you're, let's just guess. Let's say you're a presidential candidate whose name's on the D.C. Maddow phone list. Better hope nothing happens to Montgomery Blair Sibley that prevents him from resetting his blessed 72-hour countdown clock. Or else the way he explains it, if that happens, kapow, all the results come out, all the records. Now, I mean, who knows? This could absolutely be an empty threat. He has shown no proof that he has done this. And of course, without access to the documents ourselves, we can't verify his claim one way or another. But this is now what he is claiming on how he has acted to protect this information, how he has acted to protect himself as the possessor of this information. So that's one dead man switch. Second thing that has happened today is that his application to the United States Supreme Court, which says that they should release him from this restraining order and let him release the escort agency records, that application to the Supreme Court got put on the docket at the Supreme Court today. Look, that's the Supreme Court website. And yes, it is April Fool's Day. And it does say it was docketed on April 1st, 2016. But apparently the Supreme Court does not make April Fool's jokes. And this is real, and it really did get put on the docket. Now, that does not mean that the Supreme Court is necessarily going to hear this case, but it does mean that Chief Justice John Roberts will take a first crack at deciding whether or not the Supreme Court should take it up. And honestly, I'm not a lawyer, just a layman's observation. It seems very unlikely that the Supreme Court would take up this case, but it is now on the docket. They will now at least consider taking it up. It is a possibility. And now here is what you need to know about what this may or may not mean for the US presidential race. Because if what the lawyer's saying is true, if there is something in these unreleased DC Maddow phone records which is relevant enough to the presidential race that it could affect the way people are going to vote, or it may affect something else important about the race. If that's true, then speed matters, right? Timing matters. These records getting published now would have a manifestly different effect on our country than these records getting published in, say, December after the election, right? If they really are something significant, the timing matters. You got to go fast. And so the DC Maddow lawyer is going through these channels now. He's applying to all these different courts. He's asking for permission to be released from the restraining order so he can release these records legally. But he is also explicitly threatening that if it's the only way he can get them out, he'll release them illegally if he has to. Montgomery Blair Sibley, the lawyer, gave us this statement today, quote, "Trusting that the Chief Justice will promptly make his ruling and allow me to file my request to modify the restraining order which prevents my release of the DC Maddow's records, I will be taking no action with those records until he rules. That said, quote, if I am denied the right to file and receive a hearing on my motion to modify the restraining order, then yes, I will release the records of the DC Maddow relevant to this presidential election." So what he's saying is maybe the Supreme Court will take this up. Maybe the Supreme Court will say yes and take this up, in which case he will wait until they rule and he will not release the records. But if they say no, if they are not going to take up this case, they are not going to clear him to release those records, he says unequivocally he will release them anyway. So that's one way they might get released. The other way they might get released is if something happens to him that prevents him from clicking his 72-hour countdown clock, in which case he says they'll be released automatically by virtue of the fact that he has not shown up to click reset. At least so he says. And maybe this is all a cock and bull story. Maybe there's nothing in those records. But he's the DC Maddow lawyer who released all the other records. There was a lot in those records. And he says not only are these records extant, not only do these records exist, not only does he have access to them, but he says they are relevant to this election. And if he is right, we are all about to find that out soon. Because one way or another, these things are about to come out. TikTok, everybody freak out.